Welcome to Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss, and this is the point where I always say 60 minutes of deliciousness coming up. However, this episode is a bit different. It will have moments of deliciousness, but they'll be surrounded by critical information for the future of this planet and all life upon it. And this is kind of a strange request, but in the hope of not sounding too dramatic, I'd like to request that when you listen to this following conversation, please do it at a time when you can actually give it your full attention. My guest is Dan Saldino. He lives in England and has worked for the BBC for over 25 years and reported on food since 2007. He is a regular writer and producer on the BBC's The Food Programme, which you can hear on the podcast of the same name. He's the recipient of numerous journalism awards, including a James Beard Award for Best Radio Show Audio Webcast. His book, Eating to Extinction, The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them, contains 40 startlingly significant food stories and puts forth the reasons why biological diversity on this planet is at a crossroads and why everyone needs to take part in the effort to save the diversity that remains. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure.
Well, I hope it'll be a pleasure for everyone to listen to. I think it's going to have its highs and lows, but in the end, as I felt when I finished reading your book, it was very optimistic. So I hope that's the way we communicate with everyone who's listening to us. So I'd love it if you'd start out by just reading a part of your book that we talked about before we actually began the interview, because I think it'll give people it'll set the stage for what we're about to talk about.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. So this is from the introduction, where I'm setting out some of the big ideas of how the book came to be and why I think this is an important subject. Of the 6,000 plant species humans have created over time, the world now mostly eats just 9, of which just 3, rice, wheat, and maize, provide 50% of all calories. Add potato, barley, palm, oil, soy, and sugar, that's beet and cane, and you have 75% of all the calories that fuel our species. Since the Green Revolution, we eat more refined grains, vegetable oils, sugar, and meat, and we depend on foods produced further and further away from the places we live. As thousands of foods have become endangered and extinct, a small number have risen to dominance. Often this has happened without us really noticing. Take soy, domesticated in China thousands of years ago, a bean relatively obscure outside Asia until the 1970s, and now one of the world's most traded agricultural commodities. Used in feed for pigs, chickens, cattle, and farmed fish, which in turn feed us, soy plays a starring role in an increasingly homogeneous diet eaten by billions of people. Seen in the context of 2 million years of human evolution, these dietary shifts taking place at a global level, all pointing towards uniformity, are unprecedented. This is happening as we're just beginning to understand the importance of diversity to our own health. The richer our gut microbiomes, the trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other microbes we all host, the better for us. And the more diverse our diets, the richer our gut microbiomes become. On top of the nutritional loss and genetic loss taking place, there is a cultural one. Over millennia, humans discovered myriad ways of cooking, crafting, baking, fermenting, smoking, drying, and distilling their foods and drinks. The number of people in possession of many of the world's traditional food skills and much of the world's ancient knowledge is dwindling, from methods of cheese making to techniques for preserving cuts of meat. These are essential parts of our heritage and are being lost. We look to paintings, sculptures, cathedrals, and temples for the greatest examples of human creativity and vision. But we should also look to the endangered foods in this book, whether a cultivated grain of rice from southwestern China, a rare cheese from the accursed mountains of Albania, or a piece of cake baked in Western Syria. Each of these foods is the product of invention and imagination and the wisdom of generations of unknown cooks and farmers. This book is definitely not a call to return to some kind of halcyon past, but it is a plea to consider what the past can teach us about how to inhabit the world now and in the future. Our current food system is contributing to the destruction of the planet. 1 million plant and animal species are now threatened with extinction. We clear swathes of forests to plant immense monocultures and then burn through millions of barrels of oil a day to make fertilizers to feed them. Out at sea, we have significantly altered 90% of the oceans. Marine wilderness itself is disappearing. And while we destroy biodiversity, we extract tremendous quantities of water from rivers and aquifers to irrigate green revolution crops in a loan that cannot be repaid. Our food is both the cause and a victim of all of this harm. The productivity of a quarter of the land surface of the earth has been seriously compromised, hampering our ability to grow food. We are farming on borrowed time.
So I think everyone can probably understand why, when they read this book, as it was for me, this was like a roller coaster ride, because this was just the beginning. And then there were these 40 stories that unfolded with all kinds of information as part of them. And of course, I was just reading the book, right? I wasn't living it, but you were living it actually, because you didn't do your research just sitting behind a computer at a desk. You actually were on site participating in these stories, basically, as people were explaining them to you.
Mm.
And you went, you saw, you ate. You say in the book that when you were looking for honey in the baobab tree, that when the honey was thrown down, you were stuffing it in your mouth just like the other in the group, and you were a bee larvae in your mouth as part of the experience. You ate fermented sheep meat. And that was in what was
The
off
Faroe Islands.
the
Yeah.
Faroe Islands. That's right. And you say it had a taste between Parmesan cheese and death. so,
Mm.
so
That's how it's been described.
yeah.
Mm.
And so what was it actually like, for you living these experiences
Mm.
and being with all these different peoples, and actually not only telling their stories, but as I said, actually being a part of their lives for some small period of time.
Mm. Well, when people ask me how long it took me to write the book, there are two answers really. One is it was 3 years of writing the book. So that was sitting down and then structuring and writing each of those 40 stories that you mentioned. But actually, it was 15 years in the making, because I wanted to actually witness these stories. I'm not an academic or a botanist or a chef or a farmer. I am a storyteller. I'm a journalist. And so what I wanted to do, rather than write a book that would be for academics or for farmers, I wanted to write a book about these food stories that mattered to me, and for them to reach as many people as possible, and for it to be full of wonder as well, because that's the thing that really drew me in at the beginning of this. I'd come across a catalogue, an online list of the world's most endangered foods, which had been created by the slow food movement founded in Italy in the 1980s in opposition to fast food. In the 90s, they created this catalogue called the Ark of Taste, because they noticed that food traditions in their region, flavors, types of food plants, crops, breeds of animals, were all disappearing. And by the time I arrived at discovering this catalogue in 2007, there were thousands of foods from more than 100 different countries. And so I started to explore these stories, because for me, they were really a gateway to different parts of the world and our food history, and actually human history as well. And so I wanted to not only understand why they existed in the first place. So again, this is a book, for me anyway, at least, full of wonders of how peoples have survived over thousands of years in different parts of the world, and the ingenious ways in which they've grown, produced, gathered food. And I wanted to understand that story, hence the kind of this wonder of the story of humans and human evolution, and the hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and then the arrival of agriculture. So I wanted to understand how diversity of our food came into existence, and then to understand why it was disappearing. And the only way I could do that was by meeting people who were saving some of these endangered foods. So as you've mentioned, Stephen, around 40 stories in the book. Each one of those stories is only possible to tell because there's somebody out there trying to save it. So like you, I think there are really big moments of optimism in the book about these inspirational heroes who are doing so much to save different foods in different parts of the world that actually I've concluded we all need.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain the timescales you worked in while structuring how the material in this book was put together? You know, maybe along with that, it's a few minute history of the evolution of the entire human food system.
Yeah, there are multiple timelines in the book. And so, for example, as far back as 3.5 billion years, when I talk about the arrival of biological diversity, the Cambrian explosion, all of those events in deep history that allow us to understand how precious it is that we've arrived as humans on this planet at this particular time, but we are enjoying this inheritance that literally took billions of years to evolve. And you know, for example, wild grasses that arrived tens of millions of years ago, but actually some of our human ancestors started to domesticate as hunter-gatherers around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and China and Mexico, and turn them into the crops that we have today of wheat, rice, and maize. So yeah, 3.5 billion years, 2 million years of human evolution, 12,000 years of agriculture, and then roughly in the book 150 years in which we have completely transformed our relationship with the planet and food, and also created what some people will argue is a success story of the abundance of calories because of modern farming systems. But actually, as I mentioned in that section that I've just read, Steve, it's also the idea that that's only a short-term blip in human history, and there are many reasons we now understand why that success story is built on borrowed. We are farming on borrowed time, really. And I think about our dependence on fossil fuels for this abundance that we've created, this agricultural abundance, because of, for example, fertilizers that we need to use to grow maize, rice in monocultures, and then also, well, the kind of foods that we've created during that period, are they truly good for our health? Because again, the huge diversity that existed over time, we evolved as a species with diversity, but our diets and our farming systems have become really narrow. And so I think there are real warning signs that we are now increasingly aware of what looks to be a success story of abundance is actually fragile, vulnerable, and in some cases harmful.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in the book that today over 1 billion people still source some of their food from the wild, as when we were essentially hunter-gatherers. Why is that important for us to understand the significance in relation to how our physiology was structured and has evolved?
And as you mentioned, Steve, there's a particular structure to the book where in part one, and there are 10 parts with a chapters within each part dedicated to a specific food. Part one is all about wild food, and it's about that that lifestyle, which to this day remains the most successful human lifestyle to date. It sustained humans for the longest period of our history so far, which is as hunter-gatherers. And what I wanted to do in the stories there, which cover, as you mentioned, the honey story, which took me to East Africa to spend some time with the Hadza, who are some of the last remaining hunter-gatherers practicing no form of agriculture in Africa. And also that section of the book explores a food system in Australia of the indigenous Aboriginal people that goes back tens of thousands of years. There are other stories from Northeast India and also from southwestern Colorado in the States as well. Now, why does it matter in the 21st century to refer back to this wild hunter-gathering past of our ancestors, and also some of the few humans still practicing that? Well, multiple reasons. Let me give you a few examples. Think about the Hadza. Their potential menu from the wild over the different seasons of the year consists of 800 different plant and animal species. And I mentioned in the introduction, the section that I read, about the emerging science of the gut microbiome and how the diversity in our guts of these trillions of microbes is understood now to be increasingly influential on our physical and mental health. Well, if the Hadza are, they're thoroughly modern humans, but they are still living as hunter-gatherers, but they are also a clue in terms of how we evolved and how our ancestors might have eaten. But what we can say for sure is that it was full of diversity. And so there's a kind of an argument really that diversity is going to be beneficial to all of our health. But if you unpick modern diets, it's not nowhere near the 800 different plant and animal species that Hadza consume. Also think about the story of the Australian people, the Aboriginal people that I described their relationship with the land and how they foraged for a wild tuber called the yam daisy. And again, this was a source of food that was rich in energy and nutrients. And they tended the land in such a way that this was a source of fuel for them, really, but also, delicious, that required no chemical inputs. And also, finally, there's a story from Northeast India, which is where citrus originates. And in the book, I talk about the importance of these so-called centers of origin, where our foods originate from: wheat in the Fertile Crescent, as I mentioned, maize in Mexico, and citrus in northeastern India. We need the biodiversity of those centers of origin, because that's where most diversity can be found and where the traits that we will need, genetic traits within the world's most important crops, can be found. And when I say traits, I'm referring to characteristics of particular plants that might confer disease resistance or the ability to have greater drought tolerance, for example. So those genetic resources exist in the wild. Fortunately for us, there are those small populations who are protecting those resources that we might need for crops around the world, because our crops, as I argue in the book, are increasingly vulnerable to disease, to climate change, to lack of water. So we need options for the future. And some of those options are being found in the wild.
And interwoven with this is this whole complexity of natural surroundings, the interaction of these peoples with nature, the fact that these stories about the food are central, but it's the same spread over to the fact that the cultures are also disappearing. And running throughout this whole thing, these characteristics that are present now, as opposed to the huge changes since colonization began in different parts of the world. And you mentioned the negative impact, for example, of Western diets that have been forced on indigenous peoples, resulting in significantly lower life expectancy, like in the Aboriginal peoples, for example. I think it was 10 years, maybe, difference in life expectancy once they had been taken off their, you know, and moved away from their hunter-gatherer type of existence. The rise of other health problems, for example, among the Native Americans of type 2 diabetes. And
Mm,
you talk about some of the people who are involved in those stories that are essentially trying to pass on this knowledge to the current generation. So,
mm,
not only it doesn't die, but also to try to reverse the trends that are occurring,
mm.
the health, the deleterious health trends essentially that are occurring with all those people.
Yeah, I'm one of those heroes in my mind is Carlos Baca, who I traveled to southwestern Colorado to spend some time with, and he is somebody who was a successful chef in a resort, cooking all kinds of different cuisines from around the world, Italian, French, and whatever, and said there was one cuisine I never got to cook in a professional restaurant, and that was, in his words, the food of my people. And he is a Native American, and had started to realize that the way his relationship with food as a professional chef was not making the impact he wanted. And so he walked away from professional kitchens and traveled to different parts of the state to actually find out what kind of traditional knowledge still existed, and also what kind of plants were still being tended or foraged using that traditional knowledge. And so I met him in a kitchen as part within a community center, and he was inviting people from different parts of the Southwest to come from their communities, and again, Native Americans, many of them with very little or poor access to good food. And what he was saying is that he was on a mission. He told me to decolonize their diets because as you mentioned, high levels of carbohydrate, sugar, ultra processed foods. In a kitchen, he was teaching them about wild meats, about flour made from acorns that he had soaked in rivers to get rid of the bitterness, and a lot of this they wouldn't be able to do in their daily lives, but actually he was just giving them a powerful education in what had been lost in the space of just a few generations, that actually was their inheritance,
Mhm.
and was actually in part a solution to some of the health impacts of modern diets in their communities. So he'd become not just a campaigner or somebody who was just trying to do this as an academic exercise of studying lost traditions. He was out there teaching, educating, and studying this food history so that some of it could be brought back and could benefit people and their communities.
Right. And in the book, you actually quote him as saying that he believed there is within each of us a kind of biological memory, a connection with food that exists on a cellular level. All he was doing, he said, was teaching people to tap into that memory through cooking. And again, a quote, think about it. These ingredients were part of our diets for thousands of years. How can that not have been passed on in some physical way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really blew me away when he said that. Actually, to say, you know, these modern foods have only recently arrived as part of the human experience, whereas again, humans had evolved, and some communities had evolved with specific foods that could only exist in the environments that they found themselves in. And this idea that he was describing of the fact that they had been so instrumental to the survival of a community, in some cases for millennia. Yeah, it's completely. I just love that idea that actually somewhere within us, we are physically programmed to respond to that food. And I think, there are many other people I met in the research of the book who were basically telling me there's huge amounts of evidence that we are programmed to detect the good stuff, the really healthy stuff. That's been distorted by modern palates, which have become sweeter and sweeter, and obviously so many of our food choices are edited. But there was a story of the wild citrus from northeastern India, huge cultural appreciation of sourness and bitterness, where there are some, that's a clue to some really beneficial chemical compounds for our health that actually have been mostly driven out of the food system. Again, sweetness has been the driver for the modern food industry.
Dan, I want to also mention, because I was leading into that last question, talking about culture and the relationship of these different peoples with the natural surroundings. And some of the stories that you related were so mind-blowing in relation to, for example, and I would love for you to share a couple of them. So it's beyond, it has to do with food, but it's in terms of the interrelationship between species, so that you have the person who essentially talking to a bird, right? Bird and the human forming a kind of communication loop that allows both of them to get what they want. And you have these people who have been saving and reintroducing more buffalo into the Southwest, who are doing some type of ceremony prior to the release of these young buffalo back out into the wild, and they start to chant, and all the buffalo just stop and stare at what's going on, as opposed to you saying, normally, if strange sounds come into their environment, they become agitated. So this is some real wild stuff. I mean,
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is, the full title is "Eating to Extinction: The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them." And I could have just written a book which was basically saying we need genetic resources, we need huge amounts of agricultural diversity, because we need those traits in a increasingly unpredictable world. But actually, I felt that there was what I discovered as I was researching this and answering that question to myself of why should I care, is that there was this more profound, deeper story that, as you say, it's about food, but it goes beyond food. So, for example, the Hadza story that you mentioned of the collaboration between two species, human and bird. So the human, the hunters, their number one food, their favorite food is honey. It could take them hours to go tree to tree in search of bees' nests. So again, going back to this story of human evolution, we think possibly 700,000 years ago, a million years ago. Certainly it has a lot to do with the human control of fire and the use of smoke. So the hunter-gatherer goes out among the trees and does a particular type of whistle, which attracts the bird, which is called the honey guide, scientific name indicator. The bird responds and leads the hunter to a tree where the bird knows that there is a bee's nest. The bee's nest is too dangerous for the bird to approach, although the bird wants wax from the nest. And so the human who has smoke can smoke out the bees and access this high energy, high protein food, because it's full of wriggling larvae and crunchy bees trapped in the honey. And the hunter leaves behind some of the nest for the bird to access. So again, this mind-blowing interaction between bird and human going back that far in human history, and yet at the same time, it's possible that we could see the disappearance of that conversation between bird and human, because in that very same trip, I saw huts that had been built on the periphery of where the Hadza hunter-gatherers live, full of cans of sweet, sugary soda and cookies and biscuits. And so it's almost as if these pressures are bearing down on them. But again, in the space of a few years, it could be that 1 million-year-old human story is over. And I think that's just such a tragic, profound thing to contemplate, because in that part of Africa, it's where the earliest human footprints have been found. It's where some of the oldest archaeological remains, stone tools, also have been found there. So this is the birthplace of Homo sapiens. And to actually see that practice still, and again, it goes beyond skill. The idea that a human and a bird can have that collaboration, a productive collaboration, and it could disappear after such a long time. I think that goes beyond it's about food security or whatever. There's just something deep about the human story that we are seeing disappearing. The other one you mentioned, and this is the story of the bison and the mass slaughter that unfolds in the 19th century. I think what I took away from that also is that this idea that yes, it was a really important and in some cases sacred animal for the indigenous people for an extremely long time, an important source of food, an important source of materials as well, whether that's bone or hide. And again, they had, that was a more harmonious relationship that had taken place for millennia. And it was in the 19th century, obviously, with technology, weapons, the trains arrive as well. And so the ability of humans to bring mass destruction to the Great Plains becomes possible, and fueled by greed and many other factors. But that animal was actually part of a wider ecosystem in which other plants, animals, birds revolved around the movement of the bison. So when the bison was driven to near extinction, it wasn't just that as a species that disappeared, it was an entire ecosystem, a functioning, complex ecosystem. And as you mentioned, it's not only the worst of the ability of humans to change the world, in a sense, that destruction of millions, perhaps herds of what were 30 to 60 million animals, but also the very beginnings of a conservation movement in the early 20th century, and efforts by a relatively small number of people to save the last of the bison and bring them back. And the conversation, what you described there of the bison and the way they were responding to a ceremony, that was the experience of one of the scientists working to try and breed or kind of help increase the bison population and release them back into the Great Plains. And what she observed as a scientist were members of a tribe beating a drum and performing a ritual. And she understood the behavior of those animals better than anyone. But all of a sudden, instead of being agitated, which is what she expected because of this ceremony, as the singing and the drums started to make this noise, the bison fell silent. And then when the bison were released onto the Great Plains, hundreds of people had gathered to watch this and to actually hear it and experience the sound of the animals across the land as well. And people just started crying instantaneously. Just this experience of watching these animals moving across that landscape was an powerful emotional experience for them.
Yes, and that's each of the stories has its own emotional impact. And certainly for me, as I said at the beginning, it was a roller coaster reading this thing, because it was like at some points I was depressed, at other points I was elated, at some points I was actually crying, at other points I was smiling, and that's to your credit, great
Thank
writing,
you.
being able to, just live the story as best I could along with your writing. So Let's try to make this real also for people in another way. You mentioned in Turkey, if I get this right, in the 1960s there were over 18,000 varieties of wheat that you could find in Turkey, and by 2016 there were less than 12 pre 1960s varieties in use. So I think that's, and maybe you have a couple of other examples like that that you could give people, just so that this is very concrete for them as to what's happening in terms of this
Mm,
disappearance of biodiversity.
yeah, and we're talking about a part of the world in which um, wheat was domesticated from those wild grasses that I mentioned. And because of this length of time in which these wild grasses had been domesticated into different types of wheat, and over a very long period of time, because of environmental factors, different types of soil, different altitude, different levels of rainfall, but also cultural preferences. Some people preferred the look and the taste of some types of wheat than others. Huge amounts of diversity was created, and huge adaptation takes place in the crop as well. So that, again, those genetic factors mean that um, the population of wheats in different parts of the country um, develop, again, traits suited to the conditions. And what happens in the post-war period in the 1940s and 50s is this really impressive, amazing crop breeding program, which we now call the Green Revolution, in which scientists were concerned about a growing global population, and they were also wondering how that population was going to be fed. There were certain breaks on the productivity, as they saw it, of existing crops. So we had chemical fertilizers that had been developed at the beginning of the 20th century, but the crops weren't really able to maximize the potential in their growth, because they would absorb huge amounts of this nitrogen fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, and fall over. And so, and then also disease was a factor as well. So the most famous crop breeder of all, Norman Borlaug, one of the key figures in this green revolution, took different types of wheat and bred a new generation of crops that had certain types of disease resistance, but also were shorter. They were dwarf wheats, which meant they didn't grow too tall when fertilizer was used and fall over. Instead, they produced huge amounts of grain. And so successful was that breeding program that pretty much the same type of wheat spread around the world, replacing all of that diversity of all those locally adapted crops, which we call landrace crops. And land races are not only genetically different as you go from one part of a country or a farming area to another, they're also genetically diverse within a field. And that provides a safety net, really. So what we see happening in a very short space of time is the replacement of these traditional landrace diverse crops with these high yielding productive green revolution ones. There are a few issues there. One is that they do depend on that fertilizer, which requires a huge amount of energy, fossil fuels, for them to fulfill their potential. And as we know, that's an issue today. They also require huge amounts of irrigation as well, water. So again, as a short-term success story to stave off hunger at that time, absolutely, Norman Borlaug was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1970, but himself acknowledged that this was only a short-term fix. This wasn't something that we would be able to sustain going forward. And yet we became locked into this system and complacent in many ways. And so many of those green revolution crops are vulnerable to some types of disease. One's called Fusarium head blight. It's a fungal disease, and it loves uniformity. And wheat blast is another. And so the idea here is that diversity gives us resilience because it's adapted to different conditions and not vulnerable to, if a disease can hit one, it can hit them all. So that's a really short summary, Steve, of why it is that those Turkish varieties, but also many others around the world as well, were lost, and why it's become an issue. And I think if I could just illustrate the same concept by referring to a story that people might have come across, which is the story of the banana. A similar thing happened. So there are 1,500 different types of banana around the world, but we've depended for most of the world's bananas, traded bananas, on just a couple of varieties. One was the Gros Michel, which again was the first really globally traded banana. But because it became so genetically uniform and was grown in monocultures, it was overwhelmed by a disease. It was replaced by the Cavendish, which is the present day globally traded banana. And what's happening? Well, that's grown almost as clones in monocultures, and it too is now under attack from disease. So for a short period of time, these intensive monocultural systems can produce huge amounts of calories. My argument is that actually it's an experiment. We don't know. The evidence is becoming clear that there's fragility in that way of producing food.
And in addition to that, Dan, there's fragility, I think, in the system that it's created in terms of the multinational companies that are essentially control the seed business and the chemical business throughout the world, because there's just a few companies that control most of the, what is it, over 50% of the seeds and over 50% of the herbicides and fungicides that are used by farmers everywhere. So instead of seed saving, what farmers always used to do, they're locked into a system by raising these monocultures. They're locked into a system where they have to buy the seeds every year, and they have to utilize the chemicals to maintain the possibility of a crop that they can eventually get some kind of economic benefit from.
And it goes back to that green revolution story I've just described, which I mentioned the chemical inputs that were required for this new type of farming and these new crops. And no surprise that this was extremely lucrative and important for the chemical companies at the time. And what we see unfolding over the decades that followed the Green Revolution is that those chemical companies start buying up seed companies. So they actually had the whole package. The seed, which, as you mentioned, it's not open pollinated. These are hybrids. What that means is they won't grow true, and you can't save them and replant them. They are bred in such a way that you need to go back to the seed company for the next season. And so, yeah, this consolidation that's unfolded around the world and concentration of power is another kind of loss of diversity that we've seen, because before there were hundreds, if not thousands, of seed companies. And why does that matter? Well, I'm talking to you from Europe right now, where a war is raging in the Black Sea region. So Ukraine and Russia, extremely important wheat growing area. So possibly around a third of the world's traded wheat comes from that Black Sea region. Huge populations around the world are dependent on that wheat. So some of the most vulnerable populations, including in Egypt, huge wheat importer. Now in Turkey, we've been talking about that as the place where wheat begins, but now they are dependent on imports from that Black Sea region as well. And war has disrupted that supply and revealed the fragility of the world's dependence on one region for much of its wheat. So again, I think it's a wake-up call that we've become so dependent on what appears on the surface to be a highly efficient, productive system, but is extremely fragile. And war, also during the pandemic, we saw fragility in the supply chains there when some foods weren't available. It doesn't take much to actually undermine and create huge amounts of instability in the food system. So yeah, diversity of every kind really is important.
If you want to hear more about the direct impact of this war on food supply, Dan has recently done a podcast on the BBC Food program that centers around that particular issue, and you can find it any place that you normally listen to your podcast. It's called the Food Program. That's PROGRAMME, by the way.
Thanks, Steve. It's an
Right,
important detail.
right. So Dan, um, let's talk about seeds because we've been talking about that, and there are before people get totally depressed. let's let's talk about the different places in the world where the diversity is being harbored. We'll say. Saved in vaults, for example. And let's also, if you don't mind, tell the story of this man who I can't believe nobody, I mean, I certainly never heard of him before. And I'm sure there's plenty of other people who've never heard of him before. Nikolai Vavilov, who played an unbelievable part in waking up uh, many people to the necessity of diversity.
Well, and Nikolai Vavilov is his life story actually is really important to know, simply because it's evidence that it's not just this isn't just a new issue, and certainly I'm not telling a new story. Vavilov was a Russian botanist who in the 1920s was traveling around the world collecting seeds because he understood that diversity was important for the future of humanity as he saw it. He'd grown up in Russia in the 19th century and probably could relate back just a few decades to other major food-related crises, such as the Great Hunger or the Great Famine in Ireland, in which the same type of potato, the lumper potato, was planted on the same soil year after year and became overwhelmed by a fungal disease. 1 million people die and many more millions leave Ireland. And so Vavilov dedicated his life to trying to prevent further famine. And one way in which he believed that could be achieved is by collecting all of the diversity that he knew was out there and mapped where a lot of this diversity could be found around the world. So this idea of centers of origin, so the different parts of the world in which our crops, our foods had originated, where he argued also where the greatest amount of diversity, genetic diversity of crops could also be found. And he wanted these to be saved for the future so that future farmers, future crop breeders could use them. And so he created a seed bank in St. Petersburg. And that was a place where his travels to many different countries, 5 continents, led to his own personal collection being stored there of 150,000 different seeds. And it's a really tragic story because when in the 1940s, the German army besieged St. Petersburg, and many people died of hunger in the city, but there were some really determined colleagues of Vavilov's who understood his mission to save these seeds for the future. And so they risked their lives and they looked after those seeds during the occupation. And in many cases, there were people who went hungry, even though they were surrounded by a source of food, were the seeds. And the rice curator, for one, died of starvation surrounded by rice because they believed in Vavilov's mission to save this genetic diversity. Vavilov himself, by that point, had fallen out of favor with Stalin and had been sent to prison. And the saddest sad part of the story in terms of Vavilov is that he died of the very thing that he'd spent his life trying to prevent, which was starvation. He starved to death in a Soviet prison. But his work and his life inspired other botanists, including one called Jack Harlan, who, when the Green Revolution was really making an impact on the loss of diversity around the world, was trying to say to people, we need to wake up to the idea that genetic diversity matters and that there are risks we are creating in the modern food system. Jack Harlan, in turn, inspires another botanist, Carrie Fowler, an important American botanist, who then goes on his own mission to create a place where all of the world's seed diversity can be backed up. And he lobbies for this to happen. He has a breakthrough conversation with the Norwegian government, who fund a seed vault, which is built within the Arctic Circle called Svalbard. And that today is where all of the seeds around the world, including samples of seeds from the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg, are backed up for safekeeping in this very secure vault at the end of a tunnel, which has been created through the ice of the Arctic Circle, just on the west coast of Norway. And in a sense, that's a good story. It's an important thing that 100 years of seed collecting has given us, that this backup, and all the other hundreds of seed banks around the world. But that's all they are, really, is that they are a bank. And what we really need to see is diversity in farmers' fields, so that those crops are continuing to adapt and evolve and remain viable, and to give us options for an increasingly, or what looks to be an increasingly unpredictable future. But absolutely right, Steve, that these seed banks and the seed savers over a long period of time are real heroes.
And I mean, we've only touched the surface. We haven't even gotten off the surface of the land and talked about the oceans, which is another part of your book, a very important part of your book, and an important story too. But unfortunately, time just continues to march on here. So I want to thank you so much. Hopefully we could have another chance to visit in the future. But it's been just amazing talking with you. And thank you for sharing these stories. And I hope you'll continue to do that. The food podcast is a great one, the food program on the BBC.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks so much for spending obviously a lot of time going through the stories, and I hope enjoying them. But also, I think there are huge lessons to learn from each one of those individual stories that cover wild foods, cereals, the sea, our relationship with animals and livestock. So it was a real passion to write this book. So it's great when I come across people who've really found a lot from the book as well. So thank you.
Dan Saldino has been our guest. The book is Eating to Extinction: The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. You've been listening to Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss. Great Taste originates on KICI 105.3 FM in Iowa City, Iowa. The show is edited by Michael Cotton, and if you'd like to contact me, you can contact me through my email at steve@thefoodverse, FOODVERSE.com. I'll leave you with these words from Dan on the role each individual can play in changing the current story of the extraordinary loss of biodiversity that we've been discussing, and the ongoing adversarial relationship with the natural world, the fact that so many people around the world suffer from malnutrition and lack of access to food. Dan writes, if we want to save endangered foods, those in this book and many others, two things need to happen. The first, which seems easier because it's in our control, is to shift our own thinking and actions around food. By thinking more like a Hadza. Did I pronounce that right, by the way?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. And that's one of the indigenous peoples we encountered in the book and that Dan's talked about. We can make the connection between the food we eat and the ecosystems we exist in. The second, which might appear almost impossible, is to rethink the global food system. Aside from the fact that we have to, that we have no choice, it is possible because it has been done before.